Altitude. Altitude.
Sup? Nukes, the ultimate symbol of freedom and American wartime ingenuity. In the many years since the United States dropped the power of the sun twice on Japan, we have harnessed the raw power of nuclear fusion, creating massive forces of death and destruction, evicting natives.
FBI, open
up! Sorry. Peacefully relocating natives off their islands, and not to mention building massive nuclear power plants. Nonetheless, nukes and nuclear power aren't the topic of today's video. However, today we're talking about nuclear-powered cruisers. But first, we need to talk about how nuclear reactors got into ships in the first place. Like the American education system, ships' propulsion systems have not changed for a long time, since the steam age in fact. Today, like hundreds of years ago, ships use steam to move their massive spinning blades of death. Nuclear-powered ships work in the same way, except instead of using various methods of loud, big bangs and hot infernos, nuclear ships split atoms. And like their destructive cousins, this atomic reaction creates heat, that then creates steam, which goes through a turbine and, well, big sharp thing go in circles. With that out of the way, what about how they got into ships in the first place? In 1954, Uncle Sam and the geniuses over at General Dynamics Electric Boat Division decided to put a defective nuke inside of a submarine. I mean, that's what a nuclear reactor really is. Don't question me! And it actually worked, and now we have nuclear submarines. Why? Because prior to this, submarines ran on diesel engines. Diesel engines need air to work. This requires submarines, during World War II, to have to surface, run their engines to charge their batteries, and then go back down underwater. Right. Let's play a game. Can you spot the U-boat? If you said this is the U-boat, then you're correct. Now, if you could make a power source that generates almost infinite power, and doesn't need air, then that means you don't have to touch grass. I mean air. Well, at least until your crew starves. Anyway, this new super submarine was named the USS Nautilus, which totally doesn't relate to any historical piece of literature concerning man-made boats underwater. After the Navy had seen the success of its first nuclear-powered submarine, they began construction of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, named the USS Enterprise. Because the Navy has no creativity. I mean, when I die, if there haven't been 20 ships named Enterprise, I will be very disappointed. Enterprise 2 Electric Boogaloo was a big success, and lasted through the remainder of the 20th century. Eventually, though, unlike her never-ending name, Enterprise was decommissioned in 2017. Right, onto cruisers. Unfortunately, there's quite a few of these, so I'm gonna try and go through them as fast as I can. The Navy soon grew greedy and expanded its fleet of potential environmental risks to include cruisers. Said cruisers was in fact a cruiser, and that cruiser was named the USS Long Beach. Long Beach was commissioned in September of 1961. She displaced 17,100 tons and, funny story, so Long Beach was actually an entirely guided missile cruiser. But during her commissioning ceremony, then President JFK, who'd served on the Navy before, basically ordered that the ship be fitted with guns. Long Beach was the only ship of the Long Beach class of cruisers. She had 2 C-1W nuclear reactors on board, and yeah, that's USS Long Beach. To the next ship, USS Bainbridge, commissioned in October of 1962, displacing 8,580 tons. She had 2 D-2G nuclear reactors and was classified by the Navy as a destroyer. However, the Navy did eventually, like every other ship in this video, classify it as a cruiser. She kept the previous trend of being the only ship in the Bainbridge class. Right, next one. USS Truxtun. You know how I said the Navy has no creativity? Well, this is the exception. Truxtun was commissioned in May of 1974, only ship in her class, Navy called it a destroyer, displaced 8,800 tons, and used the same 2 reactors as the USS Bainbridge. I mean, Truxtun is literally Bainbridge, just upgraded and heavier. Right. Finally, we have a class of ships, with more than one ship in it. USS California and USS South Carolina. California was commissioned in February of 1974, South Carolina in January of 75. These ships displaced 10,530 tons. They were bigger than Truxtun and Bainbridge. They had better anti-submarine and better anti-air systems. Generally, they were massive improvements, except for in the area of nuclear reactors, as they used this exact same 2 reactors as the previous 2 ships. Both ships were the last 2 nuclear cruisers the Navy decommissioned. Right, are you keeping up? We're almost done with the US Navy's cruisers, so bear with me. Finally, we reached the last of the United States Navy's totally environmental-friendly cruisers, the Virginia class. 4 cruisers bore the title of Virginia-class guided missile cruisers. USS Virginia, USS Texas, USS Mississippi, and finally USS Arkansas. The USS Virginia was commissioned in October of 1980, and the 4 other ships following in the years after. All 4 ships displaced 11,300 tons, same 2 nuclear reactors as the rest, and same general purpose and general shape. I'm now convinced the Navy just copy and pasted the Bainbridge repetitively. Don't convince me otherwise. They're the same ship. All nuclear-powered cruisers were decommissioned and scrapped in the 90s for reasons I'll get into. Okay, short pause please. So now you've met the family of nuclear-powered cruisers. So on to the actual topic of... Oh no. No Russia. Russia! The Kirov class. Technically, these ships were battle cruisers and not cruisers, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to say they're cruisers. The Kirov was commissioned in 1980. 3 ships followed the Kirov, all with names I'm not going to try and pronounce. Yeah, that's some creativity right there. US Navy, take note. These names aren't actually what these ships were originally named. That's because in 1991, the USSR collapsed and was replaced with the Russian Federation, which did away with the previous names, mainly due to the fact that the 4 Kirov-class ships were named after communist revolutionaries of the Russian Revolution. Anyway, the Kirov class was originally designed to counter American submarines. Eventually, though, the Kremlin decided to give these ships the SSN-19, NATO reporting name Shipwreck, missile, or rather missiles. These were anti-ship missiles with an effective range of over 600 kilometers, or if you want the proper measurement, over 372 miles. They could also reach a speed of Mach 2.5, supposedly. However, you can't have a Russian ship without a history of maintenance problems and shitty engineering. And wouldn't you guess it, but in 1990, Kirov had a nuclear accident that the USSR denied, and the ship was placed under repair. Funny how this keeps happening. With the Kirov under repair, aka given back to Russians' arms procurement, what happened to the 3 other ships? Admiral Nakhimov has been undergoing repairs since 1999 and is slated to go back into service in 2024. Probably not, though. Admiral Lazarev has been scrapped, more likely to cut back costs. And Pyotr is currently in service in the Russian Black Sea Emergency Reserve Fleet. more commonly known as the Russian Northern Fleet. Okay, now that you're finally aware of what we're dealing with, let's talk about the actual topic of today's video. So, are nuclear-powered cruisers a viable option? The answer is no. No, they are not. Look, just because you put the power of the sun into a warship doesn't mean it eliminates the costs. The fact is, these ships are fucking expensive to build, and they're even more expensive to maintain. A great example of this is the US Navy's carriers. The US military has 11 aircraft carriers in service right now, 10 Nimitz and 1 Ford. In total, it costs the United States over $100 billion to build all 11 of those carriers. It costs well over $2 billion to maintain even one of those 11 aircraft carriers. That's a lot of money for just your aircraft carriers. Now think about the fact that the US has over 100 nuclear-powered submarines. Maintenance costs alone often kill military equipment before it can see any action. A prime example of this would be the F-16XL, which I've already done a video on. Keeping it in the same branch, the USS Zumwalt went way over cost, and its maintenance cost was also pretty high. This caused the Navy to have to limit its fleet of Zumwalt-class destroyers to 3 instead of the planned 32. This high maintenance cost doesn't change when you look at the US Navy's nuclear-powered cruisers. By 1998, the 2 California-class cruisers cost $40 million to maintain, the Virginia-class cruisers costing around the same price to maintain annually. Almost like they're the same ship, with different names. That's pretty expensive for a cruiser. The Ticonderoga-class cruiser, that is in service today, and is also conventionally powered, costs less than any of these nuclear-powered cruisers, at around $20 million. If your nuclear-powered cruiser costs more than a conventionally powered ship, in both cost to build and cost to maintain, then you've got a problem. But Spectre, maintenance cost is fine and all, but it's still a nuclear-powered ship, and can thus never have to be refueled or maintenance performed on its engine. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. Nuclear reactors do need to be refueled. In fact, the United States Navy is constantly refueling its nuclear-powered ships' reactors. There is a very, very well put together schedule that almost always guarantees all 11 US Navy aircraft carriers will never be on the sea at once. But they don't run on gas, so how do they refuel them? They may not use gas, but they most certainly require uranium. And that uranium doesn't last forever, so off to the shipyard we go then. The California class was refueled and overhauled for well over $400 million. That's pretty expensive. And every nuclear cruiser I've mentioned, except the Russian ones, were overhauled, refueled, or refitted at least once. When it comes down to it, it's just a way better use of money to just spend the money you poured into your nuclear cruisers into building an aircraft carrier, or heaven forbid, fixing some of your country's problems. Money and maintenance costs aside, there's no point in the nuclear-powered cruiser at all anyway. The Ticonderoga class can do much more than any of the US Navy's nuclear-powered cruisers, and is just cheaper to build and maintain, and just deal with than a literal possible environmental accident waiting to happen. Big sun power generator isn't always the answer. Yeah, sure, it gets the environmentalists, global warming, activists, and alarmists to shut up for a while, but beyond that, it's pretty much useless. The thing is, remove the nuclear reactor and all these ships is, well, cruisers. They do the same thing as any other American, and in the case of Russia, Russian cruisers. So, once again, are nuclear cruisers a viable option in the modern age? Nuclear-powered cruisers aren't, at least for now, and not for the US. Over the past couple of years, the Navy has been shifting towards replacing its large surface combatants with smaller warships. We've seen this in the new frigates the Navy is trying to build, this being the US Navy's new Constellation class. The Navy is already retiring the literal Chad Arleigh Burke class and the aforementioned Ticonderoga class. No, seriously, the Arleigh Burke is the F-22 of the seas. I will fight you on that. Having a massive fleet of nuclear-powered cruisers just doesn't fit the Navy's doctrine at the moment. I mean, the Navy already wants another aircraft carrier, and let's face it, that's another $11 billion you won't have available for neither the American people nor a fleet of nuclear-powered cruisers. And as for those 4 Russian ships, and the Russian Navy, I say, keep fucking dreaming. Look, the Black Sea Fleet at this point in the war is either completely non-existent or a heap of floating parts in Crimea. Russia doesn't have the money to build a nuclear-powered cruisers, nor an Su-75, more Su-57s, T-95s, you name it. Kiss them goodbye, because Russia can't even find enough tanks to run a parade, let alone build an entire cruiser. Russia is over. Their military has seen its end and is racing towards it, snorting cocaine and draining the world of its plentiful supply of copium faster than America can have another mass shooting. Look, NATO could perform a thunder run, racing an entire division of armor and infantry towards Moscow tomorrow, and arrive hours later, undisputed and uncontested. The Great Russian Bear is dying, and the only hope of its survival is the removal of its fascist government, and an end to the horrific slaughter of their ancestral neighbors and equals. If Russia builds another nuclear reactor, I won't be surprised if it melts down the second it's turned on for the first time. Look, the real threat and the real problem is China, not Russia, and if you say otherwise, you're fucking kidding yourself. The PLAN plan? God damn it, China, why does your Navy spell out plan? That's some evil villain bullshit right there. Anyway, the PLAN, or People's Liberation Army Navy, takes a more small coastal ship approach than it does anything else. Well, that's because if war breaks out, they'll only be fighting in the South China Sea and not on the open ocean, like the US Navy has to be prepared to do. It's because of this that I find it highly unlikely that China will build nuclear-powered cruisers, mainly because of what I just said, but also because there's no reason for them to. Well, except to boast about their new communist Wish.com mass-produced knockoff plastic nuclear-powered cruiser. Right, so to end this all off, are nuclear-powered cruisers a viable option in the modern age? No, but here's the thing. No one was able to predict the guided missile, and that changed warfare forever. Equally, no one can predict the return of nuclear-powered cruisers. And if they do return, I doubt it will be by any of the 3 nations I mentioned, especially Russia.